3 nationwide blackouts in 6 months. Power out for 20 hours a day. Kids waiting for surgery with no power to run the operating rooms. On January 30th, 2026, Trump cut off 90% of Cuba's fuel supply with a single executive order. But here's the thing, this didn't start with Trump. It started when Castro traded an island for a patron, and patrons always leave. The power died on January 30th, 2026. Blackouts of up to 20 hours a day swept across Cuba. Hospitals switched to backup generators that ran out in hours. Surgeries were canceled, not postponed. Canceled. An estimated 11,000 children were waiting for operations that couldn't happen. More than 96,000 patients couldn't access any hospital care at all. Airlines grounded flights. The grid was running at 36% capacity, barely enough to keep the state from total collapse, but not enough for any functioning country. What triggered this collapse wasn't a natural disaster. It was a presidential order signed on January 30th by Donald Trump. Executive Order 14,380. It set up a tariff mechanism. Any country shipping oil to Cuba would face massive duties on all its exports to America. Venezuela couldn't ship, especially after the U.S. captured President Nicolás Maduro on January 3rd, killing 32 Cubans who were serving as security advisors. Mexico couldn't ship either. Every tanker captain and insurance company had to ask the same question: is this deal worth facing U.S. tariffs on my entire country's trade? The answer was no. Within days, Cuba's fuel supply dropped by an estimated 90%. This was engineered collapse. This was the third blackout in 6 months. December and January had seen outages driven by Venezuela's own economic collapse. They simply couldn't pump enough oil. But this one was different. Here's the brutal math. Cuba produces about 25,000 barrels of oil per day domestically. A functioning modern state needs roughly 70,000. That's a gap of 45,000 barrels a day, nearly twice what Cuba can produce on its own. For nearly 3 decades, Venezuela filled that gap. Before Venezuela, it was the Soviet Union. Every patron promised permanent support. Every patron either collapsed or got cut off. So the real question isn't why the lights went out on January 30th. They'd been flickering for months. It's how an island of 11 million people ended up so completely dependent on imported fuel that a single executive order could paralyze the nation. The answer goes back to 1959, when Fidel Castro made a choice that looked permanent but never was. And that's where the story really starts. Watch the timeline march forward through dependency. Wiki, Soviet-Cuba relations, Soviet subsidies kept Cuba's power system alive from 1959 to 1991. When the Soviet Union fell, Venezuela stepped in through Petrocaribe, delivering up to 100,000 barrels a day at peak in 2008. But this is a dependency chart, and every line showing up also shows a risk point. Each patron becomes irreplaceable. Each one eventually fails. The orange line is Venezuela's oil exports to Cuba. In 2008, it was 100,000 barrels a day. Venezuela was keeping the grid alive. Watch it fold. By 2024, it bottlenecked at 22,000 barrels a day, less than a quarter of what Cuba needed. Not because Venezuela wanted to cut Cuba off, but because Venezuela's oil industry had collapsed under economic crisis and U.S. sanctions. That's when the problem became clear. The patron who replaced the Soviet Union was dying. On January 30th, 2026, Trump didn't just announce a policy. He triggered a legal architecture designed to be extraterritorial, reaching beyond American borders to punish any nation that helped Cuba. Executive Order 14,380 declared Cuba's government an unusual and extraordinary threat and cited ties to Russia, China, Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah. Then came the mechanism. The Secretary of Commerce would identify countries supplying oil to Cuba. The Secretary of State would recommend tariffs on those countries' exports to America. No oil was exempted. No gray market, no intermediaries, no loopholes. Any Mexican crude bound for Havana meant Mexican goods faced U.S. duties. Any Venezuelan tanker meant Venezuelan imports got taxed. It was a system designed to make Cuba's isolation someone else's expensive problem. The timing amplified the impact. 3 weeks earlier, the U.S. had captured Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro. Even if the tariff hadn't existed, Venezuelan tankers would have been radioactive. Captains wouldn't risk it. Insurers wouldn't cover it. Trump had also declared publicly no more oil or money going to Cuba. The effect was immediate and total. Mexico stopped shipping. Venezuela couldn't ship. Within days, Cuba's fuel supply dropped by an estimated 90%. The humanitarian response was swift and damning. The UN Human Rights Office condemned the order as collective punishment, an extreme form of unilateral economic coercion with extraterritorial effects. Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned that the situation could collapse entirely. The legal challenges mounted too. In February, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, couldn't be used to impose tariffs which limited but didn't eliminate the tariff threat. The geopolitical calculation was clear: make Cuba hurt enough, and the regime falls. But the embargo had an unintended consequence. It pushed Cuba directly into China's arms. The embargo was supposed to isolate Cuba. Instead, it cemented a Chinese patron even more firmly in place. Cuba's math problem is simple. The island needs 70,000 barrels a day to function: hospitals, grid, transport, everything. It produces 25,000 domestically, so it needs 45,000 from imports. Watch what happens when Trump cuts off all imports. 70,000 becomes 25,000. The grid runs at 36% capacity. Everything fails in cascade. This isn't a shortage, it's structural collapse encoded in a tariff. In 1994, 33,000 Cubans fled the island over 6 weeks, the famous Balsero crisis. December 2022 alone, 44,000. All of 2022, 313,488 Cubans reached the U.S. In 2024, the government admits 251,000 official departures. Independent estimates say 545,000 true total. 1 to 2 million Cubans have left since 2021. The island is emptying, not as a crisis, as a permanent exodus. China's solar program is the only game that matters now. In 2024, Cuba had 0.3 gigawatts of solar capacity. By mid-2026, 92 solar parks brought that to 1.2 gigawatts. By 2028, Beijing is targeting 2 gigawatts. That's enough to cover roughly 2/3 of Cuba's total electricity needs. Russia can't help Ukraine tied up its economy. Only China has the capital and patience for what Cuba needs, not short-term oil fixes, but permanent infrastructure. Wiki, China Solar Investment Cuba. China's solar program is a lifeline, but it's not a rescue. It buys Cuba time, maybe a year, maybe two. But solar can't replace diesel for aviation fuel. It can't replace oil for heating, cooking, or the industrial processes that keep an economy moving. So even as the first solar panels light up, Cuba faces three distinct possible futures, and none of them laid anywhere good. Scenario 1, managed slow collapse. China keeps building solar parks. Cuba's grid stabilizes at 50 or 60% capacity instead of the current 36%. The island keeps functioning, barely. Hospitals run at reduced capacity. Industry shrinks. Emigration continues at the current pace, tens of thousands leaving every year. The government holds on because life isn't quite desperate enough to trigger open revolt. This is the least bad outcome. But over a decade, the population halves. The state survives. The country doesn't. Scenario 2, sudden rupture. Emigration accelerates to critical mass. Security forces fracture. The regime loses control faster than anyone expects, maybe this year, maybe next. You can't hold a country together when more people are trying to leave than stay. The US might intervene militarily. Venezuela's own transition destabilizes into a regional crisis. This is the wild card. It's possible, but nobody can predict the trigger or the timing. Scenario 3, the long shot. Sanctions relief. A negotiated deal with Washington opens the door to Mexican oil, Venezuelan oil, maybe even US crude. Cuba gets the 45,000 barrels a day it needs. The grid restabilizes. Emigration slows. The economy recovers over years, not decades. But this requires Trump or a successor to decide that strangling Cuba isn't worth the cost anymore, and right now, that seems impossible. The most likely outcome is Scenario 1, managed decline. Slow collapse dressed up as stability. China entrenches itself as Cuba's patron. The lights come back on. Life gets fractionally better. But millions of Cubans keep leaving, and a nation that was once a regional power becomes a Chinese client state 90 miles from American shores. That's not victory for any side. That's just the shape of the future nobody wanted, but everyone saw coming. Castro's gamble in 1959 was simple: oil from anyone, forever. But forever never lasts. But Trump's blockade didn't create this crisis, it just made it real. If that landed, Sheridan. I'm David.